Today we're discussing loops in Java. There are three types of loops in Java. The first type that we're going to look at is called a while loop. There's also a do while loop, which is a modified version of the while loop. And then there's a for loop. So what exactly are loops? Loops are a way to make Java code repeat. So in programming, you sometimes want to do the same computation repeatedly. So that's what we're learning about. We're learning about how to make our computers do the same operation repeatedly. Okay. The first type of loop is the while loop. Let's write the most basic form of while loop, which people always use an example. Let's say count to 10. We want to write a program, a loop that counts from 0 to 10, means that's going to repeat 10 times. You can decide to copy and paste the same code like that. You see that it's tedious, right? If I want to print numbers from 1 to 10, and I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, and I have to do the same line 10 times. But using loops, I just need to write an expression that a computer can use to know when to stop. So there are three parts in any of these loops that we just saw. There's the initialization. And what happens in the initialization is that I define some variable that I'll use to control my loop. So for example, I'll call it maybe count is equal to 1. Then I have to write the condition while count is less than 11. Then in the loop body, we want to do something. First, I initialize some variable to control my loop. Next, I specify the condition when my loop should stop. So whatever I write inside this bracket will be repeated until this condition is met. So for now, count is 1. So this code is going to run. If as the code is running, at some point in time in future, count is no longer less than 11, then the code that I write inside here is going to stop. So the code I want to write inside there is I want to ask my computer to print out the number count. But if you do this, it's going to run forever because count is always 1. So you have to have now the third part of the loop, which is the increment. So here, I'm going to say, after this, count is now going to be equal to count plus 1. So what happens is, first, count is 1. The computer checks, is 1 less than 11? Yes. So it runs this block. So in the block, it's going to print 1, which is the value of count, and it's going to increment 1. So here I've said count is now count plus 1. So count becomes 2. So the loop repeats as many times as the condition is not yet met. So it's going to go 2. Is 2 less than 11? Yes, it prints, and it goes 3. Is 3 less than 11? It prints, and it goes 4. At the end of the day, when it reaches 11, it's going to check first of all, is 11 less than 11? No. So this statement will no longer get printed, and then maybe you can say that's all. Let's run this code and see what it does. You can see the result down here. Count to 10 was our first statement. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and at 10, that's all. So it was able to print all those numbers in order. You repeated the statement the same number of times. This is very useful. You can repeat a statement for a certain number of users, for a number of variables. At the moment, we're just counting numbers, but just think of all the things you can count using this. In fact, let me give you a little insight. Right now, there is a program just like this, counting internally. It is repeatedly checking whether I am pressing the keyboard to know which key I've pressed, for example. There are programs just like this that are repeatedly contacting my email server, like when you do notifications on your phone, right? Let's say you're using WhatsApp. The WhatsApp app has some part of code that has a loop like this that is repeatedly checking whether you have new messages. So that's an example. The second type of loop is called a do-while loop, and it has the two keywords do and while. In the do-while loop, you still have the three parts: initialization, condition, and increment. The difference is you invert this block to run before the condition. Let's write our do-while loop. So in our do-while loop, we want to say our initialization is, let's say, int x is equal to 1. The body of the loop, you say do and then you can give it the same code. So do this, then while comes as the last part of the loop, while, and you give the condition. So the do while loop is just a modification of the while loop. Counting to 10 is going to do this statement while this condition is true. So print x, increment it, print x, increment it, and at the end of the day, stop. So what's different between this loop and the previous one we had? The main difference between this loop and the previous one we had is that this loop will always run at least once. So you see counting to 10, 1, 2, 3 is the same thing. But the main difference between this loop and the previous one we had is that this loop will always run at least once the first time. It will always do it before checking the condition. So it will do the first time, and then if, let's say, we said while is less than 1, it will still do the same results. So you see, it's still counting to 10 and printed 1, though 1 is not less than 1. Why did that happen? Because the do while loop will run at least once before the while runs. So it's exactly the same concept, but it runs at least once before the while runs. Okay, if there are any questions? Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I would just wanted to ask the difference between the do while loop and the while loop, but I think you just answered the question.
Okay. So the do while loop and the while loop do the exact same thing. The difference is just that the do while loop runs at least once. We're going to use a do while loop in our mini project. You're going to see how useful it is. So the last type of loop, the for loop. The for loop, again, is just another way of doing all these things. Remember I said there were 3 parts, right? Initialization, condition, and iteration or increment. So increment. Right? Those are the 3 things that parts of any of the loops we have been writing. In the for loop, it is just a shortened version of that, where everything happens in one line. All these 3 parts happen in one line, and it's easier to track. That's why you see developers use for loop a lot. So the for loop is very similar to what we had before. It's also going to have the same kind of body. So in the for loop, what's happening is that Java has given us an easy way to do these 3 parts only inside these brackets here. So the first thing is the initialization, right? I do that same thing, int x is equal to 1. And then I put semicolon. That's my initialization. Still inside this same part, I put my condition while x is less than 11. And then I put another semicolon. And then the final part, I put my increment. X is equal to x plus 1. Now, this particular thing is done so often in Java that there's a shortcut for this increment. There's an increment operator that instead of typing all this statement like I've been typing, you can just say x plus plus. It means x is equal to x plus 1. So you see that it's the same loop, but initialization, condition, and increment all happen inside the declaration of the loop here. And so you don't easily forget, you don't need to keep track of it that much inside this loop body and so on and so forth. You can just write your code and it's still going to work the same way. It happens automatically inside here. Okay, let's look at the output for that. And if I run my code, same thing, counting to 10, 1, 2, 3, up to 10. So you can see that here is the same output, right? So we have just looked at 3 different ways of writing loops in Java. If you have any questions so far, you can ask.
Yeah, I have another question.
Okay.
Is the for loop equivalent to the while or the do while?
Yes, very true. It's equivalent. Remember what we said about Java bytecode compilation, right? When you compile your code, it becomes bytecode that is going to be executed at the machine level. When you compile these loops...
No, you did not get my question.
Yes, I'm trying to explain the answer. They're equivalent.
Okay.
When you compile this code, if you look at the Java bytecode that is generated, it's the same. That's what I'm trying to say. Whether you wrote a for loop and another
No, my question
developer
is
wrote
that
a while loop, it becomes the
you said
same
that
code.
the while loop is different from the do while, because the do while will increment necessarily the first time before it may not increment the second time. While
Yes.
the while loop may not increment even the first time. The
Yeah.
question is the for loop is what about the for loop?
The
Is it
for
more
loop
do
is
it
like
more
the while
resemble to the
loop in
while
that
loop or to
aspect.
the do while?
While loop.
Okay.
It is like a while loop. So the for loop may not increment even the first time if the condition is broken from the beginning. If the condition is broken from the beginning, the for loop is not going to do anything. So look at that. It said counting to 10, that's all, but it did not print any numbers because this body of the loop did not run at all. I hope that answers. So in terms of equivalence, it's more equivalent to the while loop. They are all the same. The only difference would do is that it runs at least once. And what I meant to say, what I was trying to explain when you first asked was at the level of the bytecode, they're actually all the same. So at the level of the bytecode, this does not get compared to a different bytecode from if I had used a while loop. So if you are using your loops, you can just use them performance-wise and so on. The nice thing here is that it's convenient for the developer. Just looking at this one line, I can understand all what is happening inside this loop. Whereas when you look at the while loop example we had, there are many parts to do initialization, condition, and increment, and somebody can easily get lost. Please note that in the for loop, you have semicolons to separate each part. Also note that some parts can be missing. Nice evening, everyone, and see you all in our next workshop on Monday.